everybody. Thank you. So I'm Zach. You already gathered that. I'm here to tell you some little things about Linux, with help from Kurt, of course. Actually, it's splitting at 50-50. It's not help from Kurt. So what is Linux? Do you guys know what Linux is? Show of hands, who thinks they're familiar with Linux? All right, good stuff. Of those of you who didn't raise your hand, do you have a general idea of what it is? Have you ever seen it? Yes, maybe? Okay, cool. So anyway, Linux is a kernel and an operating system. Linux is not so much an operating system anymore, but we'll get to that. Mostly, when people say Linux today, what they're referring to is a Linux-based operating system. What Linux is now is mostly the kernel, which is the part of, or kind of like what's underneath the operating system. It communicates with your computer, that kind of stuff. If you didn't know, Linux is actually the most widely used operating system in the world. And that's because, if you didn't know, Android is a Linux operating system, and Android is overwhelmingly the most used OS on a phone. So actually, if for those of you who said you're not familiar with Linux and you have an Android phone, you're wrong. Also, Linux is popular in development, software engineering in general, and it's also very popular for people who are running servers. In fact, Linux is much more friendly to running servers, databases, that kind of stuff than Windows or Apple are, but I don't know who would try to run a Mac OS database. I don't know if that's even a thing. And Linux is completely free and open source. What that means is that you will never pay for Linux. You may have to pay for tech support. That's how some of the companies that release Linux distributions, for example, Red Hat and Canonical, make their money. But all of the source code for every Linux OS actually has to be open source. It's part of the license that Linux was released under. Companies that redistribute the Linux kernel, change it their own way, are not allowed to increase the, I guess, restriction on it. And then, I guess the basis of Linux is it's modeled after the Unix OS. If people describe Linux as an operating system or a kernel, they'll say it's Unix-like, which really just comes down to Linux is a clone of a very old operating system called Unix that came around probably in the, 70s? There were various versions. It's very old. Various versions of Unix written by mostly, I think, AT&T and Intel. So then, the philosophy behind Linux. Kind of two parts to this. It's, the overarching, more philosophical part of how Linux should work, and then the technical parts of how Linux should work. So, the overarching philosophy, of course, I mentioned free and open source. In fact, if you use Linux, you'll find that there are free and open source replacements for almost every program that you use in your daily life. Like, for example, Microsoft Office has two substitutions. There's formerly OpenOffice. It's still around, but not as popular. And the more popular replacement for that is LibreOffice. In fact, some of you might have used those. And it's redistributable, meaning anyone can modify Linux to their liking and just ship it off as their own, as long as you don't sell it, as long as you don't make it closed source. That's the new GPL. The new foundation is the largest foundation that drives kind of open source and the open source philosophy. GPL means General Public License, version 2.
So what will happen if I get a Linux source code and I modify it and I make it closed source and I start making money out of it? What would Linux community do?
Sue that.
Yeah, Linux would probably try to sue you. It's a pretty clear violation of their license, so it's probably kind of an open and shut case.
Yeah, you get shut down pretty quick.
Yeah. So then the more technical aspect of the Linux philosophy is write programs that do one thing and do it well and don't break user space. So starting off with the first one, if you're familiar with Linux, you're familiar with the Linux command line, and that's basically the bread and butter of Linux. And a lot of those programs that you use on the command line, you don't really think of them as programs, like CD, change directory, whatever, and ls, which I don't even know what ls stands for. List What's the S?
Subdirectories.
Subdirectories? Maybe, who knows? ls lists your directories. But those two programs are probably the two programs you use the most on Linux, more than anything else. And they both just do one thing. cd takes you to a new directory, and ls tells you what files and folders you have in your directory. So those are two really good examples of programs that follow the basic Linux philosophy. And then don't break user space. Kurt can probably give an anecdote on this, but the idea behind don't break user space is that Linux, the Linux kernel, and programs that follow the Linux philosophy should never, ever have breaking changes. Now, if you don't know, a breaking change is anything that breaks someone's workflow, pretty much. Like if you have a configuration file and suddenly you update your computer and your configuration file is totally broken, you have to redo the whole thing. That's against the Linux philosophy. Everything should be forward and backward compatible forever, pretty much. And then a little brief history of Linux. 1987, Minix, which is the immediate precursor to Linux. It's similar. It's another Unix-like operating system that's not around at all anymore. It was released in 1987, and there were a couple problems with it. It was extremely restricted. It was very hard to get your hands on. In fact, you were only allowed to use it for academics. You weren't really able to use it for personal use or any sort of enterprise kind of thing. And it was a 16-bit operating system, and around then, the Intel 386 processor was coming around, which was a 32-bit processor, and that was starting to become really popular in personal computers. So two kind of big problems right there, and Linus Torvalds, the inventor of Linux, was not really happy about that. He wanted a Unix-like operating system that he could use for a personal computer. Distributions of Unix at the time were way too expensive for someone to afford on their personal computer. They were exorbitantly priced, and it was really not practical for anyone to have fun with it. So he decided to invent Linux. It started off as very few lines of code just to interact with his specific hardware. And he actually did not anticipate it really taking off. When he originally posted it to a certain forum, he said that he doesn't think it'll ever work with even different types of hard drives than what he has now, and here we are. But ever since 1991, when it was released, it has been maintained completely by volunteers. No one's really making money off maintaining the Linux kernel, except for maybe through donations, but people do it just for fun because they love the philosophy of the product and what it does.
So when Linus trying to invent a Unix-like operating system, so does that mean Unix is actually open source at the time?
No, because it would have been free if it were open source. I mean, you can't make something open source and not free.
So
he wanted
like copying something from scratch, but with his own code.
Yes. All right.
Okay, so Linus Torvalds, Zach mentioned a little bit as the creator of Linux. This is a guy I think is really cool. You hear about Steve Jobs all the time, but I think Linus Torvalds, from especially a programmer perspective, is more impressive. He's from Finland, and he is not only the creator of Linux, which is this massive operating system. Like Zach said, more people use it than any other operating system because of Android. But he's also the creator of Git, so he's an incredibly talented programmer. And he's also a very opinionated man. If you have your computer in front of you, I recommend Googling "We Don't Break User Space Linus Torvalds." It'll bring up an email chain he sent to a kernel maintainer where he swears at him for like 4 paragraphs because he broke an MP3 player. So this guy knows what he's doing, and he doesn't take shit from anybody about it. So he's really cool, and he's actually not that old. He was only born in 1969, so I'm not going to do that arithmetic right now, but you know. Noah decided to put is Linux better than Mac OS, and put yes. Well, and put no, but the actual answer is yes, because you don't have to pay absurdly high prices to run it on hardware that isn't that great. So, why is Linux relevant? So you hear, especially in the computer science, especially in the software engineering world, you hear a lot about Linux, and you hear people talk about Linux snobs, like I jokingly called Zach. And that's because Linux really does change how programming works. And I think in a lot of ways for the better. It's got a lot of easy integrations with dev tools. If you're in college right now and you're using version control, which you should be, you're probably using Git. And it is miles ahead of what the integrations with Windows are like. The community when it comes to Linux is very strong. It's all user maintained and all wikis and forums, so there's always somebody that has seen your problem before, especially if you're using one of the common distributions, and they will be able to help you with whatever your issue is. Like Zach mentioned, it's the most common server-side operating system. If you are doing web development, if you're deploying things to the web, there is a 99% chance you're going to deploy it to a distribution of Linux. So for that reason alone, it's important to become familiar with Linux. At some point, you're probably going to touch the web, and you'll see how much easier it is to do, especially web development on a Unix operating system like Linux. And then when you're working on these servers, you don't have a graphical environment like you might have on your home Windows machine. You only have the terminal. And so having a familiarity with these tools is also really important. Privacy is central to Linux. You don't have Windows snooping in on everything you do through telemetry. You're incredibly safe, and viruses are rare, if not almost unheard of. So it's a lot safer than Windows in that respect, and it's also very stable. Like we've talked about, you don't break user space. That means that your kernel is never going to break or change for the negative. And most importantly, we're all college students. You might get a Raspberry Pi, you might get new hardware. You don't have to pay $200 for Windows, $100 for Windows. You can just install Linux, and especially a really powerful GUI version like Mint or Ubuntu that basically gives you a Windows experience for entirely free on as many machines as you want, as many times as you want. A lot of people, especially developers, use Linux because it's highly customizable, but despite all that, it still works the same underneath. You can have vastly different desktop environments to fit whatever your workflow is, and it can also be very lightweight. It's possible to run Linux on very old hardware, on hardware that isn't the newest thing, and it'll work just fine. There's no bloatware to begin with, except for a couple distributions, but Zach will probably touch a little bit on that. And then workspaces are a feature that have existed in a lot of distributions for a long time. A workspace being you can have basically multiple virtual monitors on your machine. The command line is like Zach said, the bread and butter of Linux. You on Linux have a great command line experience. It's not as crappy as it is on Windows. If you use the Windows command line, or even if you use Windows PowerShell and you switch to Linux, you'll see how bad the Windows command line is. A lot of development happens on the Linux command line, which means that a lot of effort has gone into making it streamlined and easy to use and intuitive. It, in a lot of cases, like I said, comes before you would even use a GUI. Things like Git and SSH are built right in, so you have these really important tools that you're probably going to use a lot on Linux, and they are already integrated, super easy to use. And regardless of your terminal environment, because it is very highly customizable, Oh My Z Shell, if you're on Linux, is something to definitely check out. You can theme it to your heart's content with pre-built themes or make your own. But at the same time, it works the exact same for everybody, despite your customizations. You have a ton of options like Hyperterm or Z Shell or Bash. Another really important thing about Linux is package managers. So your traditional workflow on Windows, if you want to install a program, is probably to buy the disk and buy the disk and install it, or go to the website and download it. And occasionally that's still the case on Linux. But a lot of the time, because so much Linux software is free, if not all of it, you can have repositories that are community maintained that you can just pull directly down from. And that's something I'll demo in a little bit once I spin up a virtual machine. It makes it super easy to install applications. It's not a big hassle. If you're doing something on your development computer and then you need to switch over to your deployment server, it's the exact same thing to install it. Super easy. All you need to know is the package name most of the time. and it makes updates super easy as well. It is a 2-command process to upgrade, and the other thing is you know nothing's going to break with those upgrades 99% of the time. And because Linux runs on so many different hardwares, all the worry about your hardware and your versions is abstracted away for you. You don't need to worry about 32-bit versus 64-bit 95% of the time, which is really nice. And now Zach's going to talk a little bit about the concept of distributions.
So remember back when I said one of the first sentences of my talk about why we don't really think of Linux as an operating system, mostly what we refer to as the kernel? Well, this is going to be why. Basically, Linux has, rather than just one operating system, like you download Windows or you download Mac OS or whatever, you have distributions. Or distros, which is what most people are going to say. So basically, the idea behind a distro is that it's someone's own packaging of Linux. Distros are very similar for the most part. There are some very different ones, and I'll get into the differences. But I guess you can think of, I don't know, how would I explain? You know what, I don't have an analogy, screw it. Distros are different people's packaging of the Linux kernel. A common one that you've probably heard of is Ubuntu. In fact, if you use Linux, that's probably the distro you have on your computer, just because it's the most popular and extremely user-friendly. But there are different distros because people want their computer to do different things. Sometimes people just want an easy user experience. So you're going to download something like Ubuntu if you want to build it yourself. You're going to download Arch, and if you really hate your life or just have absolutely nothing to do, you'll download Gentoo. But really, distros are more than that. It's more than just personal preference. Some are really good and built for running servers. Like I said earlier, some are built for an easy user experience. So basically, it's getting your own version of Linux tailored to what the heck you want to get out of your computer. Some of the most common distros are Debian, Ubuntu, Arch, Gentoo, and Android. You all know what Android is, so I'm not going to go into depth on that one. Okay, I did not expect this slide here.
I'll come back to that and put it out of order. I wondered why that wasn't there.
All right. So, I'll start with Debian. Debian's actually a very older distribution. It came out in 1993, so what was that, 2 years after the Linux kernel? So it's been around for a very long time. It's still fairly popular today. It's one of the most popular distributions. It's pretty user-friendly, maybe not quite as easy to get into as Ubuntu, but I mean it has a visual installer. That's a big help. In general, you don't need the command line for anything. You can use it the same way you use Windows or Mac OS. It's been forked into many other distros. In fact, most of the popular distros today are based off of Debian. And it's still really commonly used. One thing that Debian is going to have in common with most other distros is the package manager it uses. It uses APT, which is Advanced Package Tool, and then if you're very new to Ubuntu, you probably use, or Debian or whatever, you use the graphical interface Aptitude, which is just a very convenient centralized location for you to install all your packages. That's how you install almost everything on Linux, like Kurt said. So then Ubuntu. Ubuntu's by far the most popular distro for personal use. There are many different flavors of Ubuntu. There's the classic Ubuntu. You can get it with different desktop environments, and even schools now, not so much in the US, but a lot in Europe, are starting to use a flavor of Ubuntu called Edubuntu, and it's just Ubuntu tailored to education. It's based on Debian, so this is kind of why I mentioned Debian earlier. You see Ubuntu's the most used distro based on Debian. It has the same package manager. For the most part, works exactly the same way. Ubuntu is extremely user-friendly. It's probably the easiest to get into. Like I said earlier, the graphical installer is very nice. I don't know how many of you have actually ever installed an operating system if you've not used Linux, because I imagine most people buy their laptops with Windows already on it. But, you can do everything graphically. It's got a gigantic user community, of course, because it's the most popular distribution, and it's actually one of the few Linux distributions that is developed by a company. The only other one I can think of is Red Hat. And Canonical makes its money through providing tech support, mostly not for individuals, that's not really going to help you, but companies that use Ubuntu or governments, whoever's running a giant network of Ubuntu computers, that's where Canonical is going to get their money from. So then Arch Linux is not an extremist kind of Linux operating system, but it is very minimalist and extremely configurable. It's not user-friendly at all, at least not to start out with. You can make it behave identically to Ubuntu if you really want, but that's usually not the experience that people are going for when they download Arch Linux. It's when you're installing it, you don't get the. You'll see earlier when we boot up the VM, you don't get the nice desktop and everything. In fact, you have to download a desktop yourself if you want. You have to download all your network drivers and stuff like that, but it lets you configure it exactly the way you want. It's not bloated at all, meaning, in fact, the only two programs that aren't part of your drivers and kernel that you get when you download it are VI and, no, I think that might be it. I think and the package manager. VI is always there. And usually the first thing people do when they download Arch is install a desktop, because most people aren't comfortable not using any graphical programs ever. But that's something you might want to do if you're using a server. No need for graphical programs, because everything you're going to need, Git and SSH, that kind of stuff, is just command line tools. People also like to build it up into not their own operating system, but make it their own as much as possible. It's extremely configurable. Not that Ubuntu and other Linux distros aren't configurable, it's just Arch doesn't come with anything you might not want, because it doesn't come with anything. It's extensively documented on the Arch wiki. This is a resource you're probably going to want to use if you ever have a problem with Linux, even if you're not using Arch, it's probably the same solution, since Linux does have all the underlying mechanics, I guess. It's all the same. And it has a very large user-contributed repository collection. For those of you who use Ubuntu, if you're downloading something that's not in the default repositories, you're going to add a PPA. If you use Ubuntu, you probably know what that is. And however, Arch Linux, they're all centrally located in something called the Arch user repositories. So then Gentoo is for people who hate themselves or something like that. When you download Gentoo, you don't download binaries. When you download programs on Gentoo, you don't download binaries. You download the source code, and then you compile it yourself. It takes a very, very long time to set up a Gentoo machine, like multiple hours, days maybe, because, of course, you are compiling the operating system yourself, which in my opinion is a ridiculous thing to do. But, I mean, that takes configurable one step further than Arch Linux and way beyond any other Linux distro. You don't even get all the programs that are installed by default. You compile them. However, that makes it, ridiculously configurable, but also extremely hard to get into. It's something I would definitely not recommend for a beginner. So you have to learn a lot about how programming or how compiling massive programs works, compile flags, what parts of each program you want to compile. It's not always easy. I've personally never used Gentoo, but I'm not interested because it sounds like too much work. But the side effect of all of that is you have complete control of what you have on your computer. Whereas, with Arch, even though it's kind of minimalist, you're going to get certain drivers like a graphics card driver and some basic network drivers, sound card drivers, all stuff like that. Someone who's using Gentoo might think that stuff is all bloat. Say you're working on a server, why would you want any sort of sound drivers? You're not going to listen to anything, so don't install them. That's basically what Gentoo is for, is just installing only the parts of an operating system that you know you're going to use. This is you.
So, with distributions, there's a lot to keep in mind when you're picking one, but I'm going to backtrack because I put this in the wrong order. But there's also a lot to consider about why you would choose Linux over a Windows or a Mac machine. And I kind of already touched about why you should, but it wouldn't be fair to do that without talking about why you shouldn't. And the big reason you shouldn't is that games don't work on it. Anything else I probably wouldn't accept as an excuse, but it is not as widely supported as Windows program-wise. There's a lot of programs that aren't on Linux that are on Windows, but like we've talked about, there are replacements for most of those programs. Proprietary software, if you're relying on one specific piece of software and that's not on Linux, then you're kind of out of luck. And then there are problems on Linux with some hardware not being supported. But if you install it on your laptop, I don't think you're going to have any problems. It's more of the niche hardware and things like that. So, all this talk about Linux. Let's say you are inspired after listening to us talk about Linux and you want to get started with it, or you're going to get started with it as I do it in front of you. There are a couple of very easy ways to get into it. If you've never played with Linux before, I probably wouldn't recommend just overwriting Windows and going at it full speed, because what if you don't like it? That's a big hassle. But one of the things you can do is dual boot. So things like Ubuntu and Debian and Mint, which are all distributions that are very user-friendly, they work very well when you install them over top of Windows. So you can install them over top. I'll talk about dual booting a little bit more in a second. And then there's also VMs, which is what we're going to do today, which is basically running it on top of your operating system that you have now. And links for that are in Slack. So VMware, I guess, is what I plan to talk about first. And that is what we're going to do here in a second. It's great for testing out distributions. Zach just went over 4, but there are dozens of them. So to find the one that's right for you, it makes more sense to spin up a VM than it does to image your machine. It's great for making quick, clean installs if you need to test something on a clean machine. It runs on top of your OS, which does mean that there's some pretty heavy memory consumption going on there, because you're not just running one operating system, you're running 2. Luckily, Linux is usually pretty lightweight, which is nice when it comes to that. You get to define most of your hardware setup. You get to choose how much memory it has, how much RAM it has, all those things. And then it's also free for all students, because you can use VM Workstation Player, which I linked to in Slack, or Noah also linked to the Microsoft Imagine program, where you can download Microsoft's versions of VM players. Your other option is dual booting, which starts to get a little bit harder. You'll download the ISO, which basically just means the image you would get on an install disk, and use a tool like Rufus. If you just Google ISO to bootable USB, you'll find tools. I recommend Rufus. And you can create a USB that you can boot from. You'll plug it into your laptop, change your boot device to that USB, and it will guide you through installing. It'll give you the option to entirely overwrite your computer, or to take a little bit of space on your desk, on your hard disks, and choose how much you want to use for your operating system. And then every time you restart your computer, you'll get the option to boot into either Linux or Windows. So that is another option if you like what you see in the VMs to do that. Definitely back up your computer before you do that, though. Things can and have gone wrong doing that. So let's go ahead and do a quick demo of how to spin up a VM. So you have your VMware, you have your VM Workstation player. It's going to work the same on almost any of them. It'll look a little bit different if you're not on Mac, and unfortunately I was going to use the Windows one, but my computer wouldn't work. So you create a new VM, and you can select your ISO, which I presume is create a custom on this, right? No? Import an existing? I don't know what that means. Install from disk or image. Okay. I didn't realize that was clickable. See, that's why you're where'd you put that? Downloads? Desktop. That's why Mac is worse than Windows or Linux. Super unintuitive. So you're going to select your ISO image, which if anybody is trying to follow along and you haven't been able to download that, I have it on this flash drive. Just raise your hand and I'll throw it to you. And then we can do our account name and our password, which I will make ACM. So Noah, don't use this for anything serious. And then it'll give you the option to customize. So I can change where it goes. I should also be able to change the hardware on it. Oh, okay, I was not able to. Unless that was, see, I've never used this one though. Press play, okay. So then VMware or your VM Workstation player, if you're using the Windows one, it's much more intuitive to change your hardware settings. I could have configured how much space I had and things like that. And then it's going to boot up Ubuntu. It's going to basically install Ubuntu to this virtual machine. And then while it does that, I will do a little bit of a demo of some of these more common things. So while this happens, because this is going to take 4 or 5 minutes, do we have any questions? Any comments? What distro do you use? Things like that. Yeah?
I like Linux Mint.
Linux Mint?
Yeah.
Why do you like Linux Mint over Ubuntu?
I recommend it for other users, not just Ubuntu, besides Ubuntu. It's very similar to the way the interface is, very similar to Windows.
Yeah.
They do a lot of different things other than Ubuntu.
What?
There's a lot of little things like
Oh, is that how I would have said it? Oh. Okay, so if you're on Mac, Noah just showed me that a window popped up that I saw this window, I didn't realize what it was. This is how you would configure your memory and things like that. How many cores are dedicated to your VM and all that good stuff. So, any other comments on distros? Mint is another one we didn't mention because it's another very user-friendly distribution, and Jesse's right, it does run very similar to Windows. Laura, you run Mint, right? No? Too much work. Who else runs Linux in here? Okay, cool. And those of you who don't, are you interested maybe in now trying it out? This is all free stuff.
You're installing it on my laptop right now.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. So if you're on Mac, you also have the option. Mac is also based on Unix, so you have the option of doing something similar. I don't think you do. You definitely. Yeah.
okay, you're saying for the updates.
Yeah, you would want it for initial updates because your ISO isn't going to be the most up to
Your
date.
ISO's 3 years out of date, so.
Yeah, for real.
About Raspberry Pi. Raspberry Pi, is that an example of a Linux
Yeah.
operating system?
So if you've used a Raspberry Pi, that's Raspbian, which is based off Debian, and that is also another example of Linux. Yes.
In addition to Rufus, I use Uni.
Union,
Uni.
Yumi,
Y-U-M-I.
to create a bootable flash drive
And it lets you install multiple
onto the same flash drive.
on the same one.
Huh, that would be useful because this one doesn't have a live installation, but when I did it, I had to overwrite like a 16 gigabyte flash drive for one installation, which is like a 2 gigabyte file. So you want to get started with Ubuntu, definitely check out these programs. They are free like we've talked about, and it looks like we're done. So that is pretty lit.
So do you prefer VMware for running virtual machines?
I use
I mean, I normally use virtual box.
whatever the Windows. Is Windows VMware Workstation Player? I can never remember. Yeah, I use VMware Workstation Player, which is entirely free on Windows, but I guess you might have better options through Imagine. So this is what you're going to see the first time you boot up your VM. You'll see your login screen with the user account you set up during the... How the heck does does Mac work? Okay, so here we go. So now what I have is basically my very own Ubuntu running on top of Noah's Mac OS. So, like we talked about, your terminal is really the bread and butter of your Linux experience. And in Ubuntu, the command for, oh, screw this. I don't know how to do this.
Command is control.
I'm just going to search it. So there are hotkeys to bring up terminal, which is what I would have done. And it looks like we can actually read that. That's cool. One of the things we've talked about is this command line and how central it is to everything. So on Ubuntu, Git already comes installed. So, oh, it does not. I could have sworn it did. So, this is a great introduction into your package manager. So, on Ubuntu and Debian, your package manager is apt, but you can't just install things. So if I did apt get, which is the command to install something, and I did git, it's... Ah, that's right. You know, you get in front of people and things change. So it tells me I can't do it because I don't have permissions. That's because Ubuntu has this, and all Linux operating systems have this concept of the root user. And the root user in a lot of ways is really similar to your administer user on Windows, in that it has the power to make deep down changes to the operating system. But it has this side effect of making it super locked down when you're using other accounts, which makes the thing safer. So I can do sudo, which is super user do, which puts me into root mode for one command and one command only, git install. And then it wants my password. And now it'll install git. And that is the exact process you would use for anything you wanted to install that was in the package manager. So yeah, you have to know the name, but you have this wonderful resource called the internet, which is going to give you guides on the commands you want to use. So let's say I don't know the command for moving around in the Linux terminal. You just Google looking around in the Linux terminal. In fact, I don't need to do that. Everybody knows how to Google. So if I want to change, if I want to look around and see what's there, ls, which is different from what it would be on Windows, which is dir, which apparently also works on Linux. But you don't want to use that. It's one extra keystroke.
It also doesn't color your results.
Yeah, that's true. It does not color our results. So blue there means that it is a directory, and then white means that it is a file. So I can change directories into pictures and make a directory, which is make dir. All these commands, while they might not seem all that familiar the first time you boot in, they become a second nature. And that's what we've talked about, kind of getting used to Linux, so that when you're in these server environments, it's all the same, it's all a consistent experience, and you get used to it. Dom.
Talk about the man pages.
The man pages, yes. So let's say I knew that the command make dir existed, but I don't know anything about it. So I can do man make dir, and man pages exist for every single command and every single program as well. They're required to write them for any program they would make, right?
Man exists, right?
I bet it does. So man is an interface for reference manuals. So all your programs are going to have instructions on how to use them, all your little options, and all the good things. And I can scroll through this document. Man is the system's manual. Pager, each page argument given to man is normally the name of a program. Blah, 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 blah. But let's look at man make dir, which tells me how to make a directory and give it a mode and make it verbose. And so I can do make dir verbose, dom sucks. And now we have a directory called dom sucks, and we can put pictures in there that are bad pictures of dom. So you have, yeah, so let's go back to pictures and change D to dom sucks, and then now we have a Git repo of pictures of dom that are rough. So it's all integrated in. It's super easy to configure your command line. Mine looks a lot cooler than this. It gives me information on my Git repos, all that good stuff. Anybody have cool commands they'd like to have shown off? Or any questions as well? This is one I like, is sudo apt get moo. What's the SL? Is it install
Yeah,
SL?
I don't know if it's in the official repositories.
Yeah.
What's that? So,
I'll show
Or
you.
if you type
So
ls,
you type ls and it works. There's no files in this directory, so that turns up negative. But if I type SL and I mess up, I'm forced to sit and watch a train drive by. So
it stands for steam locomotive.
yeah, you know what SL stands for, but not ls.
That's true.
this works in L words. Is there a way that you could type clear and ls on the same line?
There is.
I don't know if you can. Really?
So you can string multiple commands together first off. So you have a couple of operands on the terminal, which is your and, which means to run at the same time. You have,
No.
it doesn't?
And means back to back.
Oh, it means back to back.
Sequential, but the second one can't run until the first one succeeds.
Wait, I thought that was what the bar did.
Whereas semicolon.
And let you run as many things as you want at once.
Yeah, I thought they all started sequentially. No?
At least on Windows, it's not concurrently because I do B image.
Okay.
If you do like pipe runs and packet.
Yeah, I knew pipe ran after, which is why I thought and ran sequentially. But, so you have and, which is currently up for discussion, what that specifically does. You have your pipe, which I don't know. You have your pipe, which means that they run one after another, so you can string multiple commands together and move output through them. You have your piping options, which are your carets. You can pipe input, you can pipe output into files. So if I backed up a directory or two, so if you want to back up a directory, you'll notice I'm doing ... That's because then Linux, you have this concept of forward and backwards. Your current directory is represented by 1 dot. Your backwards one directory is represented by 2 dots. So change directory ... means move up a directory. So if I do an ls, I can see that there is Noah. So let's go back into Noah so there's actually files. And I can do an ls and pipe it to output.txt. And then I do an ls and we now have an output.txt. And we don't have Vim, but I knew that. Yeah, but then I don't get to mess around with Vim. So you can cat the output of files, which means concatenate. Lots of tools. The command line is really fleshed out. It's not the afterthought it feels like on Windows, which means that when you're developing, you spend half your time on the command line, but that's not a bad thing.
Okay, I've got clarification on the command line operators. The semicolon waits for command 1 to happen before command 2 happens. The AND operator starts command 1, and then immediately after it's done starting command 1 starts command 2.
And then, so what does pipe do if semicolon waits?
The pipe takes the output from command 1 and puts it into command 2.
Okay. So,
I think AND might have the same result if you do clear and ls, just because clear is so fast or something like that. But,
So what if you ran a move and it's all at the same time?
I've only used double
Wait, did the cow get run over? Oh my. So, like Don mentioned though, how can you run both at once? And this is going to be a test of my bash formatting. But if I do is it .bashrc? Let's do ls-a. So, like I said, everything is super configurable. So I'm using VI because that's what comes with it, and I'm roughly familiar with. So if I go to the bottom here, I should have just done a G0 or GO. Is it alias? CLS is equal to.
I think it's parentheses and quotes.
See, I don't remember.
Yeah.
Let's see what happens. So what I did just then is everything that is set up in my command line environment goes through bashrc, which is basically just my config file. RC probably stands for something relevant in this case.
Here, go back to your bash RC or whatever the hell it is.
Nope, didn't work. I should be able to just start bash again.
No, but that doesn't.
Where's your bash RC?
In home.
Go edit it again.
Should have just done G again.
It's the same way environment variables work. You need quotes around
Around the CLS?
no, around the equals and no space.
Around the entire thing?
No.
I don't know.
Press delete, and now.
Insert?
Oh shit, we're not in insert mode.
I put us in insert mode right before you did anything.
This is Vi or Vim?
Vi. It's still the same thing for the
not,
basic command.
Actually. Quote here, and clear. And then, because it's Vi, we press A here, because mouse inputs, or the arrow keys input whatever the arrow key is mapped to. They write it to the file rather than navigating.
And now I do bash. Let's see. There we go. Yeah, what do you want to do? So we're basically just screwing around now. So if you, suggestion, question. So let's do man ls. So A is all, so it shows you everything. So there's a concept of dot files in Linux, which is a file that starts with a dot, is usually hidden from the user. You can use that for config files, for environment variable files, things like that. Yeah, that's true. That's also a Windows thing. -A showed me everything. And you can see there are a ton of options here. ls-l tells me more details. On the left there, you see our permissions, which we won't get into, but there is the concept of permissions with that root user and user groups and your user. Tells us who owns the file, who last wrote the file, the size of the file, and the date the file was written to, along with the name. So John's going to show us.
Well, I always use so semicolon and the double ampersand for doing multiple commands at once. So if I wanted to do like, so the difference is that if I could say like any command, right? So like cd into downloads.
Mention tab. I did not mention tab.
Oh, okay. So tab is going to let you autocomplete. I don't know. So like if I wanted to cat the examples.desktop folder or file here, I can just type in ex and it's going to like try to disambiguate that with what I'm given. If I also want to run a program or something like that, I can do tab, and it'll like it'll say like, oh, what programs do I have installed, and then it'll try to pick one based off what I've already typed in. And if I tab can reveal like a bunch of different options as well. And if there's a ton, it'll actually let you say, hey, I'm about to display 256 different things, like hit Y to like actually let me do this. Because there could be thousands of possibilities if you want to run a program that starts with A or something like that, and you have a lot of things installed. But to run like multiple things, so say, where's the folder with DOM-sucks? Is that pictures?
Pictures.
So yeah, if I wanted to do multiple things at once, you could do cd into like pictures and then semicolon ls, and that's going to cd into pictures and then just print all the stuff that's in there. But there's sometimes where you want to run, so maybe something like, I don't know, build server and build client, but you only want to build the client, assuming these are like some commands that I've like abstracted for myself, but you only maybe want to build the client if the server like works like properly. If the server command has like not ended with an error code. So you could use a double ampersand here, and it's going to run these back to back, but it's only going to run the second one if the first one passed, and it's only going to run the third one if the second one passed. And so you can see really basic examples of this. So like I could say true, semicolon, echo, I'm here. And so we're going to get I'm here. I could also have something that is false or ended in an error code or something like that that was a falsy value. And semicolon's still going to do that second one because it doesn't care about the value of the first one. But if I wanted, I could use the semicolon, or sorry, the double ampersand here. And in this case, since the first command true, it passed and it was a truthy and it did not fail, it's going to echo I'm here. But if I did a false here with the double ampersand, it's never going to echo I'm here because the first one technically didn't succeed because its output was falsy or it ended with an error code or something like that. So that's something to keep in mind if you want to do it. I find myself doing this a lot in package.json files and node projects. If I want to like run one command and then another and then another and then another, but I can only, like the second command depends on the first one succeeding. Then I want to make sure, if I want to do this all in one go, I could do command 1, double amp, and then command 2 or something like that. So that's something to keep in mind. This will never run command 2. Or if this was some sort of like, command that would fail or whatever, obviously that's not going to work. But so in this case, yeah, fail command was not found, so it did not succeed. Therefore, we never echoed out I'm here. So I don't know. That's something to keep in mind.
You can also do the opposite with the OR operator.
Yeah, which OR being. But all right, so it is now 7 o'clock, so that is the end of the meeting. I'll stick around and mess around in Linux if there's anything anybody wants to see. I definitely recommend going home and trying out some of these VM players, dipping your toes into the world of Linux. A cool anecdote is that the people who develop Windows do that on Linux machines. They don't actually even use Windows. So it really is relevant in the software engineering world, and who knows, you might run into it on co-op. Or it might make the difference saying you know Linux when you're looking for your co-op position. So if you have anything from the start of the meeting that I talked about that you wanted to do with ACM, or you wanted to talk to me about something, or wanted to talk to Zachariah or Dom or Noah or anybody here who raised their hand that they've used Linux, I welcome you to do so. If you want to DM Zachariah or just message us on Slack or something like that, we'd be more than happy to help you get started with Linux, maybe recommend some resources and things like that. Yes?
I think you failed to mention how to back up your system.
How to back up the system? Well, there's a lot of options. Just like everything else, it's configurable. I know in Ubuntu, I have a super easy way to back up because there's a backup tool that I use where I can select removable storage or somewhere else, a different hard drive to back up my system. But yeah, that's another super easy thing on Linux that there's a tool for no matter what distribution you're on. Might have to install it, but it's there. Yes?
Say about the backup, depending on what partitioning system you use, if you have ButterFS, you can just set up a snapshot. What's left? You can save the whole system that way. Use that strong balance. There I go.
See this mark? I think you can just set that for the image or whatever OS. That's how they distribute.
What am I doing? I don't know. Oh, I didn't give it a file extension. So another important tool on Linux is Vim. So you saw I was using VI, which is like the predecessor of Vim, but Vim is definitely the editor to use on Linux. Don't listen to people that say to use Emacs, they're wrong. They don't know what they're talking about. He's right though, those are fighting words. Vim and Emacs are kind of the two big terminal editors on Linux. Vim is very difficult to get into initially because I'm here and you guys can't see what I'm typing, but if I just start typing, nothing works. The only reason something started happening there was because I hit I, and you see this little insert pops up. So you might be doing your first entry into the world of Linux, and you open up a text file, or a program opens up a text file for you, and you've just got this big wall of text. And it's telling you all about the operations that just happened, and they were super successful, or it's the man pages, and you want to know how to get out of this. Well, you type Control-C and nothing happens. And you type Control-Z and nothing happens. That's because you're in Vim, and it is built to scare new users. So you'll hit Escape, : and you see now my cursor focus has been brought down there to the bottom, and you can type Help, which brings you into Vim. So that's not going to help you, I guess, a whole lot. But the way to get out, I thought there was an abbreviated help. Yeah, so the way you get out is quit. Yeah, well, it's not going to let me out because I have this. But what I typically do, because now I've lost all that because I just quit without overwriting, is I type my file. I was going to comment, and then you type :X. I was going to type about registration, but I got told to stop. And then so :X saves your file. If you're looking to get into Vim, you want to be able to use Vim easily enough. Something you can do is Vim Tutor, and it brings you to Vim Tutor, which is entirely in Vim, and it is a tutorial. And it's going to show you how to get around Vim using H, K, L, and J. It's going to teach you how to insert things like I just accidentally did. And definitely something to look at. Like I mentioned, if you're logging onto these servers, you know Vi or Vim is going to be installed. So it's definitely useful. And then it'll give you tests and things like that. Man. All right. Anybody else have cool Linux programs they like to use?
I think PDF Toolkit is really nice.
What is it?
It's like PDF Toolkit.
Probably not installed. You can install it. Okay, so that's another thing that's useful with Ubuntu is it'll recommend things to you. You have, speaking of PDFs, LibreOffice comes with Ubuntu. If there's a bloated Linux installation, it's probably Ubuntu. It comes with a lot of stuff. 95% of it can be removed. But LibreOffice, if you're looking at making the switch to Linux, or you just don't want to pay for Microsoft Office, which you get for free from UC, but it gives you the option for a basically full-fledged text editor. The quick brown fox jumped over whatever. And so you've got access to your PDFs, you got access to your PowerPoint and your spreadsheet editors. So in a lot of ways, Ubuntu is a full-fledged replacement for Windows. It's certainly missing things here or there. Flash support is iffy. You kind of have to use Chrome in Ubuntu if you want to do things that require Flash on the internet. Floppy disk. So yeah, any questions? Any other cool programs people like? Yeah.
With Steam on it now.
Steam? Steam's on Linux now?
Yeah, it's been on Linux for a long time.
I never had any motivation to do that, so I
There's
didn't
like
know.
a serious movement in Steam and all their games to make everything compatible on Linux.
Huh, that's cool. So it is possible to play some games through a program called Wine, which is Windows emulation or something like that. It stands for something. Not as powerful as just running Windows itself, but so if I had an SSH server to SSH into, do that. But
Wine is a recursive acronym for Wine is not an emulator.
so I called it the wrong thing, but so it goes.